What's up, everybody? Welcome on inside the Business of Social podcast, powered by STN Digital. My name is David Brickley. Each and every show, we talk to the experts to get their expertise, their advice on the ever-changing digital social marketing landscape. This show is no different. Episode number 93, KG. As we're 7 away now from 100. We got to figure out make a note here. What's our 100th plan? But 93. So you got something for me on the number side?
So I only have one, and it is truly because I think this person's amazing. I used to work with him at ESPN, and he's a fellow Gator. But he wore number 93, Kevin Carter, not only a Pro Bowler,
this is
but
the second
also
time
a
where KG's just chosen. Giving me no options. Like, all right,
I go rogue.
That's your prerogative. All right, so sounds good. For number 93, I'm really excited. So this will be back to back now in terms of, we talked to on the DEI side, right? And really got into that in the last episode, and now we're going to mental health. So Liz Beecroft, she is the licensed clinical social worker. Sorry, I was going to say LCSW, but I'm like, what is that? Make sure I got that right. Licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist. She's also the founder over at Mental Sesh. But you've seen her on Sneakerhead Complex. She was on the big podcast with Shaq, which KG, I know you listened to, and this is where you kind of got the idea of having her on our program. But I'm so excited for this because, her work as a social worker, obviously now being a therapist, working with athletes, I think especially all of us that work in marketing and social media and sports, I'm just really excited to dig in, not only for the individual listener, but also anybody out there that leads a team, how to lead teams through this remote working, more mental health advanced age that we're in right now.
Absolutely. And she also works with creatives. So what better podcast to have her on? We work with sports and creatives.
This is great. So I think as a people leader, like how can you help your folks through burnout or mental health? For each individual, the benefits obviously of therapy and different apps and resources that you can use when you're going through it. And I really want to get into remote working too, right? Like there's so much to be said. We are social beings. It is now easier to drop into a funk or potentially have those negative thoughts if you're just alone in a room on a laptop. So how do you get through that? How do you make sure that you're living a healthy lifestyle and digging into things like mental fitness and things like that? So I'm so excited to talk to Liz Beecroft. She is the licensed clinical social worker and a psychotherapist over at Mental Sesh. Liz Beecroft joins me on the program. Liz, thanks so much for the time. We appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I saw your sneakerhead article. I'm a sneakerhead myself, but nothing compared to you. Do you know the total pairs of shoes that you own? Because looking at the photos, it seems like you may not be able to count.
Yeah. I mean, at one point, I think I was over 400, but I've since downsized. So I'm probably in like maybe the 1 to 200 range now. So
if you're a sneakerhead, you have to invest in more rooms, more square footage. It's a big thing just to, have a place for all of them to go. So I feel your pain.
Honestly, like we have an upstairs space and that's the dilemma right now is do we want to transform it into a dining room or do we want to keep it as a sneaker room?
Cool. So I'll ask you one more random question before we get into the meat of this podcast. I try to ask a question like this, a random question. If you were the host of a late night TV show program, who's the first guest that you book on your very first show?
Oh man, it definitely would be Post Malone.
Wow. Okay. I like that. Good answer. Cool. So this is a topic that, and shout out to producer KG. And we heard and I were talking about just like how we're both passionate about this topic. And I think a lot of folks in our industry are. Liz, a lot of folks that listen are managers, directors of digital, CMO. And I think, especially in the social media marketing world, this is like a huge topic that I'm excited to dive in with you with. So to kind of start at the top of this with your background, I'm excited to really hear and learn from you. But mental health used to be a taboo topic that nobody really talked about. I know a lot of things changed to make it more front and center, but in your estimation, what was kind of the biggest catalyst?
I mean, over the last couple of years, I definitely think that the unfortunate reality of the global pandemic of COVID-19 was something that a lot of people had to really look themselves, in the mirror. And we were cornered with the fact that mental health definitely exists, whether there were people beforehand that, acknowledged that and took care of themselves. I think a lot of people who maybe never had those struggles prior to COVID-19 really found themselves faced with the reality that mental health does definitely exist, and it's something that we need to prioritize.
I would love to get your thoughts because a lot of the, I guess, debate is the solution or is the shutdowns that we were doing during that time, is it even worse than the potential disease? Meaning there's just a lot of repercussions of not having children in school. There's a lot of people that were in abusive parent relationships or relationships. There's suicide and different things, and depression were kind of going up. Anxiety went up in a huge way. So talk about what you've seen and kind of, I'm sure, read up on in terms of the isolation part of, I guess, what COVID brought, because I think a lot of these different things got brought more to the forefront because people weren't feeling these emotions for the first time in a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. We are social creatures. That's what's kind of embedded within our brains and how we operate as humans. And, when you take that away on such a scale that COVID did to really keep ourselves safe on a physical level, there were all those, consequences that came from that, like not being able to go to school and see peers, not being able to go into an office and see colleagues, and in some more severe cases, getting away from potentially dangerous or unsafe environments at home. And so on both sides of that coin, it was harmful for people because you're putting people who might have been in unsafe situations kind of trapped in those unsafe situations. And then on the other side, people who look to their other environments for, social coping or for various reasons of support when it comes to mental health, they didn't have access to that. So we had to kind of, be a little strategic in the ways that we adjusted to how we cope and how we sit with our thoughts. We had a lot more time to be less distracted by the world around us. And so our way of coping for a lot of people or staying social was, turning to media, whether it was social media, watching movies, TV, listening to podcasts, things like that. That was kind of how we stayed connected. And that's very different than an IRL person to person connection.
What's with the folks that you work with, what was a common theme that you saw throughout, or the thing that got brought up the most, I guess, collectively, with the people that you worked with during that time?
Yeah, I think depression, anxiety. I work with a lot of athletes, and identity was something big that came up. Who am I when I'm not able to partake in my respective sport? What do I do with my life now that my day-to-day looks so different? Being taken away from competition, from practice, from training, things like that, or maybe having to make tweaks and changes into how that looks. That was a huge thing. And, working with athletes and trying to help them tap into other areas of their identity that make them who they are, that might not be at the forefront, that inevitably had to kind of step up to the plate when we were figuring out how to cope during that time.
I think it's interesting because, like, our parents' generation, right? Like the boomers, they were, and even before then, our grandparents' generation, it was sit down, shut up, and be thankful you have a job. I think at the opposite spectrum may be some folks in Gen Z that think, I want to work 30 hours a week, make 180 grand, and not have too many things on my plate and have a lot of balance. Obviously, those are two extremes, and those are both the wrong answers. But when you look at millennials and Gen Z in terms of how they handle mental health, how they're thinking about it in the workplace, what are some things that you see, and I guess what are the pros in that you're seeing?
The pros that I'm seeing is that we're definitely a lot more proactive in the ways that we tackle mental health challenges. And I think there's a lot more bravery in being willing to ask for help and being willing to talk about our stories, to share our stories. And Gen Z, they're phenomenal at setting boundaries, better than millennials, I will say, which is a really big part of taking care of your mental health. Not only workplace boundaries, but just, and, time, money, friendships, romantic relationships, all boundaries in all those respective areas. And that's something that I think, we're more willing to focus on and invest our time and energy and resources into, because we do see like the benefits of doing so. Not that our, parents' generations don't. It's just, byproduct of how we're raised and what kind of conversations were happening. I attribute a lot of that to having people in the public eye, creating conversations around mental health and making spaces feel a little bit more comfortable to do so. And, being able to connect differently now in our generation.
And I think too, just like medical advancement, right? I mean, when it even came to mental illness, maybe even depression 50 years ago, I mean, shock therapy was something they really thought would work, right? So I think just like that understanding of, the importance of mental health is definitely a positive, definitely in our generation. What do you think? I go back and forth this as a CEO and as a leader, what the workplace's job or duty is for employees for mental health, because, as team leaders, as people that listen to this podcast who manage a team, they're not licensed therapists. They're not psychiatrists. So there's like, you want to support your team. You want to be there for mental health. You want to check in on them, but you also don't want to advise and coach them on how to get through maybe a slight depression or whatever may be going on. So what is your advice for people leaders, knowing that everybody on a team at some point is going to probably go through some mental health dilemmas? How do you coach them to be a safe place for their team to go to?
Yeah, this is a great question, and actually something that I did a lot of during the pandemic. I actually did a lot of consulting and internal trainings with different companies on mental health in the workplace because, it shifted for a lot of people. And what I think is really important is really facilitating a healthy workplace environment when it comes to mental health. Do you model those behaviors that you're also preaching and talking about? How do you display healthy work-life boundaries? Because there are so many unspoken standards that leaders can set, whether they're aware of it or not. And even though they might deem themselves as like a hustler, having a hard, great work ethic, you're still setting that silent example and standard of what you might expect your employees. So one, being sure that what you're sharing, you're also modeling in that behavior and you're creating a safe environment that way. Two, that you're informed on, some of these topics when it comes to mental health. You don't have to be an expert in that, but knowing how to use the correct language, not using mental health diagnoses as adjectives is a really big one. Creating a space where, if an employee were to come and share some of their struggles with you, that you have some resources that you can direct them in the right position. Just being there to sometimes listen and, hear them out goes such a long way. You don't have to have, the answers or be the expert, and that's totally fine. And I think what I, talk a lot about with a lot of companies, and one common theme is, the idea of having a trauma-informed mindset in the workplace. I think it's so crucial. Looking at a situation or a colleague who might be having a bad day through the lens of, what's happening right now in your life, what happened to you. We often look at things of like through the lens of what's wrong with you. Someone's kind of screwing up at work and we get frustrated because it inevitably affects how we're doing our job and maybe adding more to our plate. And we're oftentimes really quick to think like, what's wrong with this person? Why aren't they doing X, Y, and Z, correctly? But if we change that mindset to think, well, what could be happening in this person's life right now that, may be playing a role in how they're showing up to work today, it gives us a little bit more empathy and a little bit more awareness as to what goes on in our personal lives inevitably seeps into the workplace. And thinking of it that way can help us kind of encounter and have those conversations in a way that make us more approachable and create a safer environment to facilitate healthy mental.
Yeah, and you might have some tangible advice on this, but what I've kind of learned is asking people like, "Hey, are you okay? Like, is everything okay with you?" And I've had instances where people have busted down in tears, told me that their grandfather passed away, told me that their brother's in the hospital, like really some traumatic situations that I was so thankful that I was told, like you said, not so necessarily the reason, but I mean, you can just handle that with so much more grace and be able to help them. Like, and a lot of people feel there's this PTSD, in my opinion, with, I think, unsafe, bad work cultures where they think if I tell my boss, I'll get fired or get in trouble. So if you do have this safe workplace, which I think here at STN we do, you almost have to break down some of those barriers. Like, no, you are going to take the rest of the week off, or you're going to go home for the rest of the day. and kind of protect people from themselves. Because I think there's a lot of cultures that don't empower that or are very toxic in that way, and then they carry that on to their work culture.
It's not even just like what benefits the company offers, but exactly the work culture, how those benefits are not only shared internally, but how we, embody that culture internally as well.
I'm sure you've checked out the documentary or heard of it, Social Dilemma. And that, as a social media marketer, that definitely even opened my mind up into a lot of things. But to stay on the workplace topic for a second, here at STN, we're a social media agency. A lot of the people that listen to this podcast work in social media or at least touch social media. That's a whole different mental health issue, right? And I'm sure you talk about this with your athletes. Getting in the app mentions can be the worst thing you can possibly do, I'm sure, for a celebrity or athlete. And I will say, for folks that are on the keys for these different brands, I mean, the trolls on Twitter are real. Something like Black Lives Matter, something like a shooting and, that mass shooting that happens. If your job is to be on social media, you can't turn that off, right? And I'm sure your number one advice for your patients is get off social media, go take a walk, clear your mind. And when you are a social media manager or a director of social, you're not getting away from that. I mean, it's constantly reminding you each and every second, potentially, as you scroll. So any advice of folks that have to be in it when there's some traumatic things going on in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to also nourish those other parts of your identity outside of who you are in your career, whether you're a social media manager, a creative, an influencer, that is only a fraction of who you are. And I think as much as time as you have to spend doing that, because the reality is it's your job and it's what, sometimes is required of your time, being able to also dedicate time doing things that don't involve social media, that allow you to really decompress and kind of put some energy into other areas of your life that you thoroughly enjoy, whether that's playing an instrument or, playing a sport or whatever that might be. Really kind of catering to that area of your life as well is super important, because when our identity just gets wrapped up into one facet of our life, that also has a huge impact on, burnout, depression, anxiety, all of that type of stuff.
I know there's no right answer here, but talking about Social Dilemma, they do an expose on just like a young woman and how they're affected by social media and kind of this, Kardashian perfect Photoshop culture. If I had a daughter right now, I don't know, like part of me wouldn't want them to have a cell phone until they're 17 years old or 18 years old. But then I'm glad that my dad put a computer in my hands at 8 or 9 years old to kind of be able to use that for my future career. So I know there's no right answer, but what feels right to you? Like when it comes to, kids, social media, not having a little bit of it, but not too much. I feel like the studies have yet to come out on how damaging and or the right answer for this stuff is.
I think it's really also cultivating an environment at home that you allow your child to feel comfortable in talking to you about those feelings, and not even just with social media, just with emotions in general.
Because it used to be magazines back in the day for like
Mhm.
our generation, right? Like
Yeah,
Maxim or whatever, right?
yeah, yeah. And how do you talk about feelings? And do you do that the same? Like, do you model that behavior at home as well? So I think that's really important, is like really allowing those conversations to happen at home in a healthy way. So, they can be open and, really trying to do things that empower and boost the self-esteem of your child, because, you're right. Like social media today, like it really is, 50%, not even 50% of someone's true identity, like what you see
The
online,
highlights.
the
Yep.
highlights, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's great and all, but it can get very easy to compare yourself. Like what I always say is it's easy to compare your IRL to someone else's URL, because we're looking at the lowest of lows in our life,
Yes.
all the things that aren't going right. And then we get online and we're seeing the things that are going right for someone else. And we tend to forget that they also have to pay bills and they have to do the same things that sometimes we go
That
through.
was kind of actually like the first few months of the pandemic was like one of the most best things that came out of it was like not as you're scrolling Instagram, nobody was flexing because they couldn't.
Yeah.
Like you couldn't even go outside to take a picture with you and your Lambo, or you couldn't, the picture of you at Bali or wherever you were at. So it was kind of fun to finally just see like everybody just chill out on that, because that was, I definitely agree with that. I want to talk about remote work for a little bit because this may be my personal just assessment of it, but I do think there's so many pros of working remotely in terms of not dealing with the commute, being closer to family, having more flexibility, being able to go hang out with your grandma, your parents, and be able to work from their house on that Thursday, Friday instead of waiting for the weekend to fly out or whatever. But I think what I'm most worried about is maybe like the person that's not as social. Let's talk about the 24-year-old male that has a roommate he doesn't talk to. He's in a 10 by 10 room that has little natural light, and his relationship with work is a laptop and Slack and Gmail notifications. And I think unless you have a really strong social life on the weekends or on the evenings to counterbalance that, I'm just assuming that you can get into a depression much quicker, much more suicidal thoughts, just get into that funk where I remember being a 23, 24-year-old kid kind of getting into a funk, and I would go into the office and it would kind of kick me out of it because someone would compliment me, somebody would make me laugh, somebody would offer me a coffee, whatever it may be. I don't know if I'm thinking too much about that, but I am worried about the studies that come out 5 or 10 years from now about maybe that person that doesn't have those IRLs that you were talking about.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's definitely like an individual person to person type of like assessment. Like, does this work for you? Great. If not, like you also have to have the self-awareness and the insight to be able to own up and say, okay, like maybe I am in a job right now that's fully remote. Like, what ways can I practice the mental fitness side of things where I'm still catering to the needs to prevent myself from going into, a depressive state or an anxious state. And it's hard because it's work. Like it doesn't come easy, but we have to have the tools and be willing to utilize them if that's the case.
Yeah, and I think, even like going to a coffee shop a couple of times a week, I mean, you see other people hustling and bustling. You kind of get like, I feel this way every time I go to New York City, right? Like that, like adrenaline rush of the hustle and bustle and people, hailing cabs and kind of like going places in a pretty quick manner. But it gives you like this jolt of energy. And I think, yeah, I'm guessing it's gonna be a lot easier if you don't. That's a great word, mental fitness. Like you have a workout routine that makes sure physically you're in a good spot, but what's your mental fitness routine weekly to make sure that you don't feel not only that you drop into like kind of like a funk, but also you feel less thin or you have anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. And with mental fitness too, like mental health is more invisible than physical health is. So that's where it's hard because unless we're doing the work for ourselves, other people might not pick up on it as much as they would if we like had a broken bone and we're wearing a cast, So
I truly believe when it comes to like success in any business sense, if you don't measure and track it, you're not going to get better at it or help it. So one thing that we did, I got this advice from a business coach, is we ask every week on a scale of 1 to 10. I've said this on the podcast before. How do you track your mental, physical, and emotional health? 1 to 10. And what it does is if somebody puts a 3 on there, as a team leader, you can dig in and say, how are you? Is there anything I can do to help? And maybe they don't feel comfortable sharing, but it gets you in really a sense of somebody feeling, I think, confident or, that they can share that information and be honest with you. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think finding a forum for employees to share how they really feel is so important. 'Cause it's just not going to happen if you, oh, hey, I'm a cool manager. Let me know if you need anything. Like they're just not going to feel comfortable enough to send you an email that their mental health is off this week.
yeah, I think that's a great thing. I think that's beautiful because it really does allow the space to be there. If someone does want to talk, it really opens the door for those conversations to be had. And if they don't want to talk, it still also gives the awareness that something might be going on. You should keep that in mind.
And as a people leader, like I want to know that information. Like I think it's just so valuable to know the same way in athletics, right? If somebody has a bum ankle or somebody has a tight back, I want to know that before I run them to the ground in practice so I can, make sure I'm being cognizant of that. Let's talk about athlete mental health because I know this is definitely your expertise. I do think just from an overall awareness standpoint, Kevin Love, I think, has been huge on this. Simone Biles in the Olympics, I think that opened up a lot of people's eyes. Like they were so confused at first, and then they realized, oh, if her mental health is off, she could like be in the air and break her neck. So maybe this is an important thing for her to put boundaries around, which I thought was kind of an interesting. That first 24 hours, there was a lot of naysayers, but I think the whole kind of nation almost flipped its opinion on that. But you've kind of talked about just the lack of awareness for athletes and the importance of mental health? I'd love for you to speak on that.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of dialogue, especially online. When you look at athletes speaking up about their mental health, or maybe not speaking up about their mental health, but you can see there's something happening, right? And the amount of, for lack of a better word, ignorance that occurs, we put athletes on this pedestal as if they are superheroes. And I think at the end of the day, yes, because they might be able to jump so high or run as fast or score as many points a game, like that doesn't mean that they're exempt from having feelings. And I think the biggest factor that I hear, or the biggest argument is, well, they're making millions of dollars, they shouldn't have any problems. Like money, unfortunately, doesn't just exempt anyone from struggling with their feelings and emotions. And for a lot of athletes, that does not mean that they've always had all of that money. It's also something to adjust to, entering into a stage of life where you suddenly have access and a crazy amount of money. And how do you navigate the interpersonal relationships in your life? So yeah, I think there's we tend to look the other way, or we tend to forget that athletes are humans too.
Yeah, and I think, especially in the sports world, you look at, I remember when Brett Favre's dad passed away, and he played that season or that week on Monday Night Football a day later, and he was definitely held up to this like, oh my God, like this amazing performance, and he did it for his dad. But like, not every athlete can like compartmentalize that way, right? Not every human. Sometimes I think for me, I'd rather just get into the work and kind of like not distract, but compartmentalize like is easier. But some people are consumed by it and need that break. So just not putting everybody in the same bucket, whether it be a teammate, an athlete, a celebrity, whatever it may be. Everybody handles those a little bit differently.
Yeah, it's not a one size fits all type of thing.
I saw this kind of interesting timing. A couple days ago, I saw this Tony Romo. I think it's one of his final seasons when he was consistently getting injured. He lost his starting job to Dak Prescott, and he said, a lot of times we think about the battle is the man in front of you, but if you can figure out how to, battle that man inside of you, that's what ultimately matters. Pretty much meaning, I think all of us have that inner critic in our head, whether that be just like our mind playing tricks on us, or that pattern behavior from parenting or past trauma. I'm sure a lot of people come to you with that, and I'm just curious how you help folks get past that inner voice in all of our heads that maybe is doubting us, critiquing us more than it should, because we could be mean to ourselves internally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big proponent of celebrating all the small victories. And when I say that, I mean, like, you get a nice email from your boss, you get a nice comment on social media, you get an award or whatever it might be, screenshot it, save it. Like, I tell a lot of my clients who are struggling with negative self-talk to really like create a photo album on their phone and just screenshot all of those things and save it to that album. All of the things that make them feel good. It could just be a compliment from a friend, whatever it is, and then review it, especially in those times where we're saying nasty things to ourselves. Because when we're in that state of mind, we're not thinking, oh, like, let me try and reframe this right now. Like, yes, that takes a lot of work, but having like a concrete tool that we can kind of just look at to kind of offset some of the feelings that come from the negative things we say. And also just to keep in mind that like our brains are meant to keep us safe, not happy. And so when the negative self-talk comes in, try to look a little bit deeper and ask yourself, like, what maybe am I feeling right now? Is it something deeper that this negative self-talk is trying to keep me safe, even though it's not helping and it's not doing that? That's just how our brains can be wired at times. Is there something deeper happening here? Maybe an insecurity or maybe an anxiety that I'm nervous about failing, or, not living up to other people's expectations. And how do I really pinpoint it and then attack that actual issue rather than focusing on the negative things I'm saying to myself right now?
Yeah. And, I have like a life coach, I have a therapist. It's incredible. I'm sure you agree with me. Every human should have a therapist because you don't have all the answers in life. So it's been great. Stay with me here because you may not agree with this statement, but to your point about your brain, your body's trying to like keep you safe. I think it all goes back like 3,000 years ago, biologically, how we're set up DNA wise, where we think that we're going to die essentially. So like the stage fright and the anxiety of presenting in front of a group of people, maybe 3,000 years ago, if you said the wrong thing in front of your tribe, you would die. Like that's why these like these things come up. So it kind of was something through therapy. I kind of realized like, why is my gut tight? Why do I have so much anxiety? And if you actually think about how we're wired just biologically, the same way where you get tired after mile 2 in a 26-mile marathon, your body's like, hey, just so you know, if you keep on running like this for 2 days, you will die. But it's kind of like your brain is maybe a little too early in that in that process. But I just wonder if you ever equate the craziness sometimes, not craziness, but just like irrational anxiety over very small things seems so intense.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're feeling a threat.
A threat, yes. That's a better way to put it.
Yeah. And, when we're in that state of mind, like it doesn't feel so small. But then when, we eventually get ourselves out of it and we're able to look back and like have more logical thought to it, like we are able to, potentially see the logic behind it and why it might not be worth investing.
I saw a quote online somewhere, it may have been TikTok, but it's like, anytime you feel anxiety, feel less than, just ask yourself, who told you that? I like that too, right? Because you talk about that inner voice in the head. Usually it's that self-doubt or that self-critic that just is like playing tricks on you a little bit. So if you're aware of that, you can at least know when it's happening, which is awesome. I want to talk a little bit about just some best practices, I think, in this remote world, but also working in social marketing sports. It can be very stressful. I sense a lot of, people that work for me too. Sometimes it's very overwhelming when you have so many things to complete off your task list. And as you grow in your career, that task list never gets down to 0. There's always more you can do. So, man, especially an athlete, when you talk about appearances and upcoming contract and you're in the playoffs and you're underperforming and your free throws are not going well, like, how do you coach people to lower that stress or that anxiety kind of in those moments where you feel like you're being drowned by it?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in breaking our goals down into smaller, manageable parts. Like, I think sometimes we tend to look at the big picture of like where we want to get ourselves to, the ultimate end goal. But, that can feel really overwhelming because we realize it might seem really far off in the distance to get to that point. So really trying to like break things down. What do I just need to do now? What's the next step? And like really making that list and checking things off the list to feel more in control of what you're doing and how you're going to get there. I think that's something that's really helpful, but also setting like healthy boundaries with whatever it is, right? Like not doing too much, because that can actually create more anxiety. It can create this cycle of, kind of coping short term or doing something that using a coping skill that's not actually helpful and actually exacerbates it in the long term. So, trying to really make sure that you're prioritizing the work-life balance, that you're also really investing that time into self-care for you, because you can't pour from an empty cup. And some of those to-dos that you want to cross off are going to seem a lot harder than they actually are if you're running on empty.
Yeah. And people always ask me about me starting this podcast. I'm like, listen, this is a selfish endeavor. I learn something every time. So I'm learning a lot already. I want to ask you, because this has been something I dealt as a people leader as well. When you have a teammate that you're leading that is kind of in that self-doubt mode, like, yeah, but there's so much on my plate. Like, oh, what if we take these 3 things off? Like, yeah, and they're kind of like, they're just looking through a prism of not negativity, but they don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. You got to be careful with how you approach that situation, right? Because you don't want to, saying certain things makes it worse or makes it feel like you don't care, you're not listening. But how would you handle that situation when somebody feels extremely overwhelmed? There's a lot on their plate. You want to help, but by telling them what to do, it may make it worse. Like any tips or advice on that?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the person. And, I would say really use the fact, like, if you know this person and their personality, use that to your advantage. Know if like sometimes humor is a way to touch home there, or if it's, being more stern and more of like a very matter of fact type of approach. Like knowing the person is huge because it really helps you curate the approach more efficiently. But what I would do is kind of, offer to take things off their plate and just remind them that like this will pass. Like this is a temporary feeling and it sucks right now, validate their feeling, don't miss it, but also, offer your support, and sometimes even just asking them, putting the ball in their court, being like, what do you want me to do? Like, what can I do to help you right now that will make it feel better for you? Because I know that we're going to get through this and this will pass, but you tell me how I can help.
I think too, like there's so much to be said about dumping what's in your head, whether that again, that inner voice or just that stress. Like sometimes when you hear yourself say it out loud, it makes you realize, okay, this is kind of a irrational, feeling that I'm feeling, whatever it may be. And I think sometimes, like, and this is personal relationships, work relationships, so listening, saying I'm here for you, like sometimes that person just needs to get it verbally vomit it out of their head so they can move past it. Because my kind of silly analogy is, I think when you don't have the answers, like your brain is like a Wi-Fi signal that can't find the connection, and it's trying to find all these different things, and it gets more overwhelmed and more anxious. But sometimes when you get it out on paper, when you get it out and just like vent it out, if you will, it's so therapeutic. And I think that's what happens a lot with teammates or employees that you may manage, and just being there to listen can get them past that pretty quickly.
Absolutely. Even journaling, like just writing it down.
Mm.
That's a great way to even like reflect back in a month or a week, and like see the actual progress that has been made.
I did that one time recently, which is very therapeutic. There's like 19 things that I was irritated or anxious about, and I wrote all 19 things out as aggressively as I needed to. Like, this effing sucks. I don't know what's going on. And then I just like programmatically went down each of the 19. Like, what's the one thing I can do that will provide the most impact to each of those? And man, like it was about a 2-hour session, I feel like, but that was an eye-opening lifetime experience for me to say, wow, this is a freaking tool that I think we all should use, and I will definitely use in the future. That like ability, and I keep on using that reference, like dump it out of your head, because that Wi-Fi signal I found anyway from personal knowledge, like can, really get your mind going in an aggressive way. So, I mean, what are some things that you're looking at as I would say we're still in this pandemic era. I saw an interesting stat that I wanted to run by you as well, Liz, is I think before 2019, 4% of workable Americans worked fully remote. That number's jumped to 54%. So I'm sure there's going to be studies in the next 5 to 10 years, but we have made this transition. This pendulum has swung aggressively to the other side of this without probably not the right best practices or tips and tricks, or just like parents right now when they talk about what age is right with the cell phone, what age is okay with social media. I think we're kind of the first generation dealing with this. So, I mean, what are some things, I guess, you think that we've learned already, and some things that are still left to be seen in terms of the balance and how we go forward the next 5 to 10 years in this new frontier?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think learning the importance of meeting people where they're at is super critical. Just knowing that, I think the reality is that when you are looking at something from a company level or an organizational level, like the reality is we're probably not going to be able to cover every single base, because every person there is so different with their own experiences. But offering different solutions, offering problem solves, and having different options for people to choose from, I think is probably the best way to try and meet people where they're at. And that also goes with like offering services that help their mental health, to help them develop more insight and awareness onto who they are and what would work for them and what won't work for them when it comes to their careers.
As a consultant, are you recommending every business find a resource, mental health wise, that managers can send their team to if they're going through it? Like, what is the right answer from an employer standpoint? Is it just a free resource? Should every manager seriously consider, should every company seriously consider investing in a mental health service that can have like free therapy for employees? Like, what's the right answer in your opinion?
I think it's a mix of that, but also I think having like a database of resources available, like mental health is so different, and finding someone that you fully feel comfortable with is such a crucial part of getting the help you need. So like, not limiting those choices, but really offering maybe a directory and establishing multiple relationships with a assortment of, resources when it comes to taking care of your mental health, and, having consistent workshops and trainings with different maybe nonprofits or professionals that can come in to cover different topics, from burnout to eating disorders to whatever it might be. I think really giving people as many tools as they can. And also, with that being said, making sure leadership is educated in what those resources are. So when people do inevitably come and talk to them, they're able to help direct them into the right direction.
Yeah, and I think all of us, when COVID was happening, we had those workshops and those series that we were investing in as leaders. And then it's like, okay, we had that therapist come 2 years ago, so now everybody understands. And that needs to be a consistent diet, right? Of like workshops, resources, reminders. Because even like the fact you might have a box folder of 97 resources that are amazing, but just reminding your team quarterly, hey, just a reminder, like it's here, because I think that just gets forgotten too, as well. We've used services like BetterHelp, which is like, so many different therapists that you have access to. It's pretty low cost. I think it's like $100 a session or what have you. And that's been, I think, a good resource, because I think the biggest barrier of entry, I'm sure you can appreciate this, is people don't even know who to call. They don't know who to start. They're kind of in a vulnerable situation, because what if the person's mean or weird or whatever? So, what would you recommend for someone that they know the value of therapy? They know it'd be very great to talk to somebody that can maybe coach them through a few things, but they're just so afraid of finding the wrong person or the search. What's that easiest barrier to entry that you found in your opinion?
Yeah, so there's actually services out there that help match you with a therapist that's a good fit, because finding a therapist is really challenging. Even as a therapist, I'm actually going through that process right now, and it's hard, like trying to get someone to reply to your consultation request and schedule a consult, or like, even just knowing like, who do I feel comfortable with? Are they trained in what would work for me? And the average person doesn't know what CBT, DBT, EMDR, like all these different, you know, whatever acronym therapy models are. So, being able to have services, there's something called mentalhealthmatch.com. I'm actually a member of Alma, which is a database of therapists, and we pay a membership fee to be a part of it. But when you go to their website, you can get matched with a therapist in their network that you can check off if you want like gender preference, age preference, like what you're struggling with, their location, their age range, like their insurance. Like it will actually sort through which their therapists accept your insurance, things like that. Because like navigating the insurance world is also really hard, knowing like what your insurance company will cover. And what I recommend is like, when you do that process, like schedule 4 or 5 consultations with different people. Give yourself like a good selection and a feel for like what is out there. And then really trying to ask questions of like what it might be like working with that person, that therapist as a client, or, things like that.
I'm asking you this because I have a family member where I'm like, I'm telling you, therapy's amazing. You'll love it. Like, and she's like, I know. And she's kind of going through it. I think like what people struggle with is, I know I had an abusive, mentally abusive relationship or an abusive parent, and I don't want to dig up all those feelings and be bawling for an hour and a half. Like, is there a way to ease into it, or like a way with a therapist? Like, I don't want to, I'm happy to start, but I can see that that's like gets you a lot of anxiety. Like, I don't want session 1 to be pulling back this entire thing. So any coaching or advice on how to let a therapist know like how much you're comfortable with early on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any therapist that is ethical and good at their job should know that if a client is hesitant to talk about it, to, try not to push them, especially if it's in the first couple of sessions. Like, we don't want to ever make someone uncomfortable or bring up uncomfortable feelings. I also think it's totally fine for the client to be like, hey, like this is something that happened. I'm not ready to go there yet, but just so you know, like that. And, a therapist should respect that 100%. I have that situation happen quite often. And, I will touch on it from here or there and just kind of, say like, I still remember you told me, but I'm not going to push you I'm here if you're ready to talk about it. Because, therapy is also there to talk about all the good things that are going on in our life too. I refer to it as like a way to help us identify blind spots in our life.
Well, it's good because those stories of positive things, like 8 sessions from now, you'd be like, now I know you're kind of going through it right now. Don't forget though, and that therapist could actually be that healthy reminder of things aren't so bad, or just a perspective, right? Which is such a good part of it. Well, this has been amazing. I want to ask you a couple more rapid fire questions. I know you gave me a few gems there the last few minutes, but any follows on social media that you think do a really good job of just the resource part of things? I'm sure you'll say your company does a great job, which I think you guys have awesome social coverage. But yeah, any recommendation on follows, newsletters, anything like that? That's an easy follow.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously Mental Sesh is great for resources. We try and get journal prompts put up every week for people who, are into journaling and creative ways to take care of your mental health, especially for those creatives and athletes of the world. I really love to follow the nonprofit Made of Millions. They're phenomenal. They have a huge database of different mental health resources, and that's somewhere that I often direct people to. Who else do I really like to follow? To be honest, like I've really been like laying low on social as of lately. But yeah, I mean, Made of Millions is probably like my favorite mental health nonprofit. I love to work with them as well. They're great.
I loved this session today, as far as just like all the tangible takeaways. I think as people leaders, it's really, especially in this new remote world, and folks, I think being more upfront with their mental health, it's so great to have these tools and tips and be able to learn. And then also, I think for just each individual to, if you haven't already, it's like, it's something that you can definitely use as a tool or resource to help you out day to day. So thank you so much for all the time and dropping all the knowledge. We appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, episode number 93. Thanks so much to Liz for joining us on the program. I like how we switch things up. I think we get into the nuances of the algorithm and TikTok and how we can utilize things like Be Real and Discord. But how about mental fitness? How about making sure we can be present at work? How about helping a colleague or a teammate that's going through a tough time? How do you ask the right question without insulting somebody or making things worse? How do you help a teammate that's going through just a period of overwhelmness, which I'm sure we all can appreciate it. So, man, I think I took a lot of takeaways. You guys saw me on that show. I'm like, let me just ask you a direct question that I'm dealing with personally. I'm going to use this platform to get some answers as well. But yeah, this is something that I talk about almost on every phone call with our friends and colleagues in the industry, KG, because I know we're all going through it personally. We're all trying to manage our teams in the most healthy way possible. So I don't know. I got a lot of value out of that one.
I loved it. And I loved hearing what questions you asked. I think too, sometimes we think of mental health as such a personal issue. How do you deal with it as a leader in the workplace? And how do you make people feel comfortable? Because it can be an uncomfy conversation to have.
And I think too, like if you're a director of social media, let's say, or a CMO, if your teammate comes to you and says, I think I'm kind of in a depressed state, again, give yourself some like grace here. You're not a therapist. You're not someone like Liz who is a psychotherapist. However, can you point them to resources? Can you say, what can I do to help? What can I take off your plate? Because, at the end of the day, success is based on the humans behind that success. And I always use an example, but the way that Phil Jackson, right, with the Bulls, like the way he managed Scottie Pippen and Michael Jordan was much different than Dennis Rodman. And I think, each one of your individual employees or teammates have a different way they like to be motivated, have a different way that they work through things. Some people compartmentalize, some people can't or don't want to. That's not how they really move through things. So I don't know. Even for me, KG, as a leader over the last 2 years, I've learned a lot about just the nuances and the precision and care that you need to take in understanding each and every one of the employees that reports to you. And again, just some great tangible ways to look at this a lot more strategically instead of, brushing things with broad strokes.
And even hearing like, it's okay to use humor if that is what relates to the person. Like I wouldn't even have thought to do that, but it made a ton of sense. And same with like the journaling prompts, like finding resources online to give people a journal entry. It's great.
I love that. All right. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Got a lot of value out of it. Thanks so much again to Liz Beecroft. Check her out as she's the founder over Mental Sesh, MENTLSESH on the Instagram and Twitter and TikTok and all those different things. So go check them out. Had a lot of fun and got a lot of value out of that one. This is episode number 93. Thanks as always to KDO, to KG for all their help on the program. This has been yet another edition of the Business of Social podcast. My name is David Brickley, and it's all been powered by STN Digital.